Okay, well, hello, welcome. Thank you so much for coming today and being a part of the community of folks interested in transgender studies. We really appreciate you being here and supporting this panel. My name is Erica Chu, and I've organized this panel with the support of the Tentacles Initiative. This is the second of two panels featuring Chicago area transgender studies scholars, and today's loose theme is risks of violence against trans people. And again, we're very excited to have everybody here with us today. Right now, I'd like to welcome our presenters and say thank you, presenters, so much for being here and sharing your expertise with us. Our first speaker is TJ Billard. They are associate professor in the School of Communication and, by courtesy, the Department of Sociology at Northwestern University. Outside of Northwestern, they are the founder and executive director of the Center for Applied Transgender Studies in Chicago, the leading academic organization dedicated to scholarship on the social, cultural, and political conditions of transgender life, and editor-in-chief of the center's flagship journal, the Bulletin of Applied Transgender Studies. Dr. Billard is the author of Voices for Transgender Equality, Making Change in the Networked Public Sphere, and editor with Sylvia Weisbord of Public Scholarship in Communication Studies, and is currently editing with Marquis Bay the Oxford Handbook of Transgender Studies. Dr. Billard's current book project, tentatively titled Cis-Informed, Disinformation and the Media War on Transgender Rights, focuses on the central role of misinformation in anti-transgender movements' political strategies in both the US and UK, why these strategies work, and what can be done to curb misinformation's influence on policy and public opinion. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Alithia Zamantakis. She is an independent researcher and middle grades social studies teacher. She earned her PhD in sociology at Georgia State University. Prior to this, she received her BA in sociology and gender studies at the University of Utah and her MA in sociology at Georgia State University. She is the author of Thinking Cis, Cisgender, Heterosexual Men, and Queer Women's Roles in Anti-Trans Violence, and co-author of Sexuality, Social Justice. Her work can be found in Sexualities, Gender and Society, the Journal of School Health, and Annual Review of Psychology, and more. She is a member of the board of directors for both the Center on Halsted and the Society for the Study of Social Problems. Thanks so much for being here, Alethea.
Yeah.
Our third speaker is Ash Stevens. They are an assistant. I promoted you. They are an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice, and affiliated faculty in Black Studies and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. As an abolitionist scholar, their work focuses on trans and gender nonconforming people's experience of policing and surveillance and community strategies to resist state-sanctioned violence. They also teach with the Prison Neighborhood Arts and Education Project and are board member with the Transformative Justice Law Project. Thank you, Ash, for being here.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here.
All right. Again, thank you so much, presenters, for being here. At this time, I'll stop sharing my screen, and TJ, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and begin.
Okay. Is everything visible?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. I am TJ Billard. Before I get going, I want to extend first a heartfelt thanks to Erica for organizing the panel, as well as for the one last week, and for inviting me to participate. It's wonderful to be here with all of you today and to be alongside my former colleague Alithia and with Ash, who I had the pleasure of being on a panel with a number of weeks ago for Trans Day of Visibility. Chicago really is spoiled for choice when it comes to the best trans studies has to offer. So, what a city to end up in. Um, the theme for today's panel is risks of violence against trans people. But I don't really study violence in a direct way, which is to say that I don't study topics like hate crime prevention or rates of victimization among trans people or community-based approaches to violence prevention, all of which are important and all of which are probably would immediately come to mind for a lot of people when they hear violence against trans people. Instead, as a scholar of media and transgender politics, I think about violence in more diffuse ways, as systemic and structural rather than interpersonal. I think of violence as practiced by the state, as enacted either inadvertently or advertently by institutions, be they educational, medical, professional, cultural, etc. And I think of violence as legitimated by media. And so, two theoretical concepts are central to this perspective. And the first comes from critical legal scholar Dean Spade, who offers the concept of administrative violence to describe the harms that are produced by bureaucratic, legal, and institutional systems that marginalize, punish, or deprive specific populations of their basic needs. And these systems include the complex patchworks of policies, legal classifications, document requirements, healthcare restrictions, surveillance, and administrative procedures that govern access to medical services, educational opportunities, employment, housing, public accommodation, legal recognition, and even just the basic conditions of social legibility and survival. And these systems, designed as they are by dominant power holders in society, are at best not built in ways to meet the needs of marginalized groups, and at worst are actively designed to exclude or harm them. Um, the second concept comes from the eminent media sociologist Sandra Balrer-Keach, who from 1968 to 1969 served as co-director of the Media and Violence Task Force of the U.S. National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. The Violence Commission, as it was called, was formed by President Lyndon B. Johnson following the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy in order to identify the causes of social violence. The Media and Violence Task Force was specifically tasked with trying to understand the role of media in making the populace more violent, echoes of which have reverberated through successive waves of moral panics about how comic books and cartoons and video games and really any popular media form that young people engage with might be inclining them toward behaving more violently and antisocially. But reflecting on the commission and on the Media and Violence Task Force she co-directed, Balrer-Keach concluded that the greatest role that media played in making society more violent was not in making the public more violent. Rather, she argued media institutions played an important role in normalizing, justifying, and legitimating state and institutional violence against marginalized populations by shaping public understandings of what forms of exclusion, punishment, and governance appear reasonable or necessary. That is, that media contributed to the maintenance of the status quo by justifying and normatively defending the use of violence by dominant groups through official means to maintain power over the oppressed. And so, informed by these concepts, my research and my activism, and entwined as they are, focus on the political and media systems that enact and perpetuate harm or perhaps violence against trans people. So, today I want to talk briefly about two facets of that work, both of which center in various ways on disinformation as a tool of violence against trans people. So, first, then, it's necessary to delineate misinformation, which people are probably used to hearing about by now, from disinformation, which is my primary focus today. Whereas misinformation is generally understood as false or misleading information shared, often on the basis of sincere beliefs through organic networks of communication and social connection, disinformation is understood as false or misleading information produced and circulated through strategic networks with the deliberate intent to deceive, manipulate public understanding, and/or advance political and ideological goals. And importantly, here I should note that though these definitions focus on the idea of false or misleading information, I don't conceive of mis and disinformation as problems of mere factual inaccuracy. Instead, the problems of mis and disinformation are rooted in the cultural narratives they support, the ways that they justify kinds of meaning making that construct trans people as problems to be dealt with, as threats to be contained, as challenges to be neutralized. In short, I understand disinformation as constitutive of what the political communication scholars Madhavi Reddy, Rachel Kuo, and Dan Kreis call identity propaganda, or narratives that strategically target and exploit identity-based differences in accord with pre-existing power structures to maintain hegemonic social orders. The first facet of my work that centers to a certain extent on disinformation as a tool of violence against trans people is my work with the Center for Applied Transgender Studies, or CATS, as we affectionately call it. Um, Founded in January of 2021, CATS is an independent nonprofit research organization that is dedicated to facilitating and promoting empirical research on transgender issues with the aim of informing policymaking and public discourse in ways that improve quality of life for trans people. And to that end, CATS brings together a diverse network of scholars from across the globe engaged in research that addresses pressing issues facing trans communities while working in direct partnership with journalists, health officials, professional organizations, policymakers, and advocates. And these efforts include providing expert commentary in news media, consulting on draft legislation and regulatory policy, contributing to standards of care and research ethics, and enhancing the capacities of advocacy organizations and community groups to try our best to ensure that political decision making is informed by expert and community knowledge rather than ideological distortions. And while this work is often a kind of triage response to the seeming never-ending political crises facing trans communities, we view our work as our tiny piece of contributing to the reconstruction of institutional systems in ways that minimize the administrative violence that trans people might experience. A small part of this work that I also want to plug is the Platinum Open Access Bulletin of Applied Transgender Studies, which offers a forum for timely interdisciplinary scholarship focused on the social, cultural, and political issues facing trans communities globally. And through this and other initiatives like public lectures and symposia, CATS strives to ensure that accurate and, most importantly, freely accessible information about trans people is not just generated, but also made widely available on the belief that if disinformation are never behind the paywall, why should we keep the accurate information and knowledge that we produce behind them? The second and more direct facet of my work that centers on disinformation as a tool of violence against trans people is my current major research project, which is tentatively titled Cis-Informed Disinformation and the Media War on Transgender Rights, which is generously supported by an award from the William T. Grant Foundation's Scholars Program. As many of us will already know, there has been an ever-growing campaign against transgender people and their rights, with legislation and policies introduced at every level of governance across the United States. Focusing only on legislative attacks for a second, in 2022, there were 174 anti-trans bills introduced across federal and state legislatures. By 2025, that number rose to 1,022, a 487% increase for those quantitatively minded among you. And already in 2026, as of just yesterday, 773 bills have been introduced federally and across 43 of the 50 US states. And these bills range in focus from healthcare access to sport participation to public facilities access to educational rights to employment opportunities to custody matters. With the vast majority of those focusing on healthcare and education, prohibiting gender affirming care and denying students autonomy over names and pronouns and the dignity to come out to their parents in their own time. In short, these bills seek to, and in many cases succeed in, enacting various forms of institutional and administrative violence against trans people, and in over half of these cases, specifically trans youth. Importantly, these laws and policies are not enacted in an informational vacuum. Rather, they are frequently motivated by and justified through disinformation about trans people, while simultaneously generating public controversy that further amplifies and circulates that disinformation across the broader media environment. And in this way, anti-trans disinformation functions not merely as false information, but as a mechanism for legitimating state-enacted violence and reinforcing a hegemonic order in which trans people are constructed as suspicious, dangerous, or undeserving of full social inclusion. And crucially, this discourse does not emerge solely from fringe online actors. Much of it circulates through what we might call mainstream media institutions that are themselves invested with substantial social, cultural, political, and economic power, thereby granting legitimacy and increased visibility to narratives that rationalize exclusionary policies and administrative harms. By that, I mean to say, the anti-trans disinformation is not only spread through link sharing on Mumsnet or the ill-advised retweets of transphobic trolls, but it's also through feature articles and op-eds in the New York Times and The Guardian, with a consistent stable of misinformation peddling authors, including, among others, Jesse Singal and Abigail Schreier. It finds purchase in primetime segments on news programs like 60 Minutes in the US and Newsnight in the UK, in best-selling popular press books like Schreier's Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, and in Helen Joyce's ironically named Trans When Ideology Meets Reality, and on some of the world's most popular podcasts like The Joe Rogan Experience, which audio streaming service Spotify paid approximately 200 million US dollars for an exclusive licensing deal. And they also find purchase online, where they're spread by figures with large online followings like Chaya Raichik, known by the username Libs of TikTok, Ben Shapiro, and Matt Walsh, and perhaps most strikingly, author J.K. Rowling and technology investor Elon Musk. And all of this is happening through public Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube pages. Moreover, in my research team's ongoing data analysis, we found that far-right political actors like the Alliance Defending Freedom, Christian Concerned, Concerned Women for America, Fair Play for Women, LGBT Alliance, and PragerU, among countless others, paid to run advertisements containing significant anti-trans disinformation on Meta-owned platforms and were permitted to do so. These advertisements, quote unquote advertisements, which Meta classifies as sponsored posts related to social issues, elections, or politics, represent very well-resourced efforts to ensure the wider circulation of disinformation with the clear and express intention of justifying anti-trans policies. And this coordinated disinformation campaign brings together the most unlikely seeming bedfellows with self-identified feminists and agents of the US Christian right collaborating in a transatlantic movement against trans rights. In January of 2019, for example, the Heritage Foundation, a Christian right policy advocacy organization active in a range of things like climate change denial, restricting reproductive rights, anti-LGBTQ advocacy, even claiming the Black Lives Matter movement is a Marxist revolution meant to destroy America. That organization held a panel titled The Inequality of the Equality Act, Concerns from the Left. And the event, which is pictured on the slide, brought together Heritage Foundation leaders and self-identified feminists like Julia Beck and co-chair of the Women's Liberation Front, Kara Dansky, to discuss their opposition to the Equality Act, which would have amended the 1964 Civil Rights Act to explicitly prohibit discrimination based on gender identity. And this was not an isolated incident. The Women's Liberation Front has received funding from the Alliance Defending Freedom. It's filed joint amicus briefs with the Family Policy Alliance. And the Hands Across the Aisle Coalition has worked to bring together radical feminists and Christian right organizations, encouraging them to table their ideological differences to oppose what they call gender identity ideology. And the significance of these alliances extends beyond conventional policy advocacy. The disinformation circulated through these networks doesn't just support specific legislative priorities, it also promotes broader conspiratorial narratives that frame trans people as inherent threats to children, women, and the social order itself. Through repeated claims that trans inclusion endangers women's safety, confuses children, or facilitates predation and social collapse, anti-trans discourse constructs trans existence as a public danger requiring intervention, containment, and exclusion. And so policies that support youth bans, restroom restrictions, gender affirming healthcare limitations, constraints on legal recognition are framed as a result, not as exclusions, but as forms of protection. In practice, though, these measures function as mechanisms of administrative violence that deny trans people access to public life, institutional participation, and social legitimacy. And these disinformation fueled narratives, which are carried in mainstream media and on ubiquitous social media platforms, operate as a form of legitimation. Media and political actors normalize and justify state enacted violence by presenting exclusionary governance as necessary to preserve a stable and intelligible social and gender order. So, what do we do about this? How do we solve the problem of disinformation as violence against trans people? I don't know. But in talking about mis and disinformation more broadly, technology expert Joan Donovan and her colleagues advocated for what they called a whole of society approach, recognizing the interpenetrated social systems that enable and encourage the circulation of false information. And this approach pushes us to recognize that disinformation is not simply a technological problem, nor is it merely a problem of bad actors online. It's a structural problem rooted in political institutions, media systems, platform economies, and broader cultural anxieties about social change. And so I agree that addressing disinformation against trans people requires the kind of whole of society approach that Joan Donovan and her colleagues advocate for. But so too does addressing violence against trans people more broadly. If violence against trans people is enacted not only through individual prejudice or interpersonal acts, but also through administrative systems, institutional practices, media narratives, and political infrastructures, then it's not enough to focus solely on bad actors or even individual laws and policies taken one at a time. We instead need to attend to the interlocking systems through which trans marginalization is produced, normalized, and sustained, and to the ways that those systems mutually reinforce each other. And from my perspective, thinking about how do we construct information ecologies that don't permit disinformation to become a weapon that can produce this type of violence. That work is frustratingly slow. It involves the long collective labor of remaking institutions, of rebuilding public infrastructures of knowledge and care, and reconstructing systems of cultural meaning making so that trans life is no longer rendered as a threat, but can instead be recognized as fully human, fully legitimate, and fully deserving of dignity, safety, and participation in public life. So I will end there. But if you want to dive deeper into anything that I've talked about today, I've included my references that are well worth reading. And I've also included some further reading where I have written on these topics some more. Don't tell any of my publishers, but if you want to read any of those things, they're on my website, just full PDFs. Don't report me. And if you want to contact me about any of this, I am occupational hazard, far too easy to find online. But thank you very much. I look forward to the rest of the panel.
All right, thank you so much. Such timely information, um, and getting timelier, I guess. Well, thank you so much. Our next presenter is Alithia Zamantakis. Sorry, Takis. Um, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and begin.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Erica and T, for organizing this. And uh, it's tough to follow up such a great presentation, but thank you, TJ and Ash, for uh, being here, and it's an honor to present with you both. And I am mostly, or I guess to start with my name as well, as Erica asked, my name is Alethea Zamantakis, she, her pronouns. And I'm going to be talking mostly about research I've done regarding what violence means rather than necessarily uh, how to stop violence or what causes people to be more at risk of violence than others, but more so what really is elicited through acts of violence. And I'm particularly in my work interested in symbolic violence, in understanding violence as something that comes to say something about both the person who's enacting violence and the person who violence is committed against, and the ways in which all of that is really enmeshed within desire. So, uh, just to kind of start with context for why any of this matters, um, you know, none of this is likely new to folks who either know trans people or just on Instagram or study trans people, but there's obviously a high risk of violence against in particular Black trans women every single year, and these numbers themselves are likely underreported and don't really speak to the stories of violence either, right? In many ways, when people's experiences of homicide are reported, their full story and the story of that violence often disappears within that, making it even more difficult to really understand what took place, why it took place, and the larger social impact of that. Because in many ways, the murder of someone is something that affects the entire community, right? It's something that ultimately impacts the way in which people view themselves and people around them, regardless of whether they're trans or not. Um, and um, just in this year, in April of this year, Devonte Curtis, who is from Chicago, was murdered by her on-again, off-again boyfriend. And she's just one case of the many examples of Black trans women in Chicago and across the nation who are murdered in particular by romantic or sexual partners. Um, I think often there's a larger discussion of a broad understanding of violence happening against transgender people because of who they are, and as this violence being a form of a hate crime or solely occurring out of individual people having transphobic ideas. And uh, I think in reality, what is needed is more and more attention to why people who date trans people, in particular people who date Black trans women, are committing so much violence against the people that they love and have sex with. Um, and uh, I think the responses to her murder say a lot in this regards, in terms of not just what the individual person who murdered her thinks, but what people at large come to understand about violence against Black trans women as it occurs from their partners. So these are just screenshots from different posts on Facebook across Chicago that were responding to posts about her murder. And you can see across these posts, right, that people are talking about the murderer not wanting anyone to know he's on the down low, or that if you choose to be trans, then there's a certain punishment that's going to come about, and this is a sign to others to not be trans. And others arguing that her on again, off again boyfriend didn't want to be exposed for dating a trans woman. Others, again, feeling like he knew he killed this person because this person was going to expose their relationship and he couldn't take that. So he did what he did. And uh, while these comments, I think there's a lot that could be said about them, and the lack of recognition of Devonte's humanity in many regards. What I think is really important to consider in regards to these comments is how violence comes to be interpreted as something that is a defense mechanism, right? For cisgender men in particular who date trans women. Transness in many ways comes to be framed as the violence that's being enacted, as an assault on cisgender people. And so the violence that cisgender men commit against them is really a defense mechanism in this regard, is what ends up being conceptualized through arguments like this. And I went backwards. anyone who knows me also knows I love Pose. So I love to include, in particular, this scene from Pose in talking about violence and the way in which it elicits different responses and elicits meaning about people. In season two of Pose, a show about primarily a group of Black and brown trans women in New York City in the 1980s and 90s in the house and ball scene. Um, these four women end up going to one of Electra, the woman on the left, one of her dates' beach houses. And while they're there, Blanca, who is this second woman to the right, meets a man who's interested in her, and she lets the other girls know. And they end up responding with an assumption that she obviously would say no, that she's insane, that it's unsafe for girls like us to walk in the middle of the night with a stranger. You know you can't trust a man like that once the sun goes down. Another girl responds, "That's true. I didn't think about that, but it is true." And they go on to say, "It does. You know, these men are afraid of their desires for us. They take it out on us all the time. They don't kill us because they hate us. They kill us because they hate what it means to love us." Which is where I take the title for this presentation from. And uh, what I argue in my work is that violence in many ways comes to be something that's seen as recuperative. It's recuperating masculinity, in particular, a hegemonic notion of what it means to be a man. And masculinity in many ways comes to uh, be touched or within a hierarchy of masculinities, lowered within that hierarchy through coming into contact with trans people. But violence really enables one to renew their position in a hierarchy of masculinities. And a lot of prior research really shows the way in which violence amongst men in particular is something that is really meant to show, right, one's masculinity, one's dominance, one's power. It is meant to really be a performance of many kinds. And so uh, in my work, I interviewed a group of cisgender heterosexual men and cisgender lesbian, bi, and queer women in the Atlanta metro area. And these individuals were predominantly Black, predominantly working class, and spanned anywhere from 18 to in their 70s. And one of the participants, when I asked him what it means to be with a trans woman, of whether or not this would change how others see him, he responded very quickly that they probably would be like, is he a little bit less straight? Is he gay? Because that is, because I know I would see them that way, and I would ask those questions. And so, G, while he had no desire to be with a woman who, in his words, had ever been a man, and repeatedly referred to trans women as men, he felt it very important to note that, um, what happens when a man is with a trans woman is that they may begin to be viewed as a different type of man. They may begin to be viewed no longer as a heterosexual man, or someone that their friends want to spend time with, but instead, it's something that ends up coming to say something about them. And for G in particular, he felt bothered by the idea that others would view him as anything other than heterosexual. And so he told me that if he were to find out that a woman he was dating was trans, that it would particularly bother him because he doesn't want a man coming up to me on the street and being into me and hitting on me and being gay with me, because then I'm going to have to set him straight. And so for G, being symbolically rendered as something other than a heterosexual man meant that he was recognized as a potential date or hookup for gay and bisexual and queer men. And rather than just accepting the fact that people are going to misinterpret how we are in our lives. He felt that he would have to do something in order to ensure that someone else is reoriented away from him, that a man's attraction is not directed towards him, but that he is setting him on a straight path. And this act of setting him straight really becomes conceptualized here as an act of self-defense. G is being hit on, and it's something he then has to do in response to this. And this is really something that the men I spoke with highlighted across interviews, and it's also something that others have really shown in both media pieces online and in other research, the ways in which men feel a particular need to enact violence when perceived as something other than a heterosexual man. So I also spoke with another participant named Kai, a 24-year-old cisgender heterosexual Black man who was very interested in psychology, and he was currently studying psychology at that time. And I asked him the same question of, really like what it would mean for him to be with a trans woman, and why someone might feel that might feel uncomfortable with others finding out that they're dating someone trans. And he responded that maybe somewhere deep down he fears he might be gay, and he's trying to run from that. And now he had it. He had sex with a trans, and for him, that trans might be like, I know you say you say you're trans, but you're still a man in my mind. And you didn't tell me, and it can hurt his pride as a man. He's having all kinds of internal identity crises, and it even feels like the person did something to me. And all of this comes together mathematically to then justify the violence that happens, right? And so while his response is really focused on a man potentially being gay and having this sort of internalized homophobia that results in a quote unquote identity crisis, it also really highlights that the man who murders a transgender woman in being rendered gay lowers in the hierarchy of masculinities to what Connell refers to as a subordinate masculinity. And masculinity really is not a fixed identity. Masculinity is a process that is both maintained and challenged. And C.J. Pascoe, in her work on the ways in which masculinity operates in school settings among young boys, notes that one moves out of faggotry by making another boy a fag. And from my analysis, I would add that one can really move out of faggotry or being perceived as gay by murdering a woman he finds out is trans, by reasserting something in the process of committing violence against a transgender woman to prove something to others. And this is something that men that I spoke to, including men who were open to dating trans women and men who also only dated trans women, like Chris, who is a 46-year-old cisgender bisexual Black man, spoke of in regards to the punishments that they face for dating trans women. And so Chris told me, I hear that every day. I'm gay. I might sit down, a woman talk to me, and somebody walk past me. Ooh, you gay. You talk to trans. I hear it every day. I walk down the street. I meet a lot of them. I stop and talk to them. I ask what their name is. But people who I know, they criticize me. Why are you fucking around with that? Right? And he went on to really elaborate that, his experience in particular as a homeless man, and being in a community of other homeless people, he was perpetually around, the same group of women and men. And these women in particular were constantly making comments, constantly making fun of him, constantly deriding his masculinity and manhood, and constantly also telling other women not to date him because he dates trans women. And Chris, as an example, really shows that, cisgender men are not alone in policing the hierarchy of masculinities, but cisgender women also play a very large role in policing this and policing relationships between cis and trans people. Um, in an interview with Vice, a young man who had previously dated a trans woman ends up revealing to his current partner that he is attracted to both cisgender and transgender women. And when she finds out, he says at first she cried, she interrogated him. Was he gay? Was she just a prop for him to look straight? Why did he hide this from her? But then she got mean. And over the course of a month, Owen, who is the young man who is focused on in this piece, said that she used his sexuality as a weapon against him. According to Owen, she pitilessly mocked him, remarking on how disappointed he must be that she doesn't have a dick. He obviously wanted to be a bottom, he recalled her saying, to get a good fucking. And sometimes when they were intimate, Owen said that she would climb on top of him and mockingly simulate anal intercourse. And so across my work, really argue that what ends up happening in the process of cisgender men dating or finding themselves attracted to transgender women is that the symbols that circulate around a social and political conceptualization of what it means to be a trans woman can also come to stick to those that love and or have sex with trans women, in the words of Sarah Ahmed. And violence becomes a way, really, of shedding these symbols. This violence isn't merely about repressing trans people, it's also productive. It's producing cisness. And as Laurel Westbrook notes, violence genders, it sexualizes, it racializes. Violence itself produces and perpetuates gender, sexuality, and race as social systems. And violence against Black trans women and the ways in which the men in my research made sense of this violence produced an account of Black trans women and other trans women as either assaultive or violating or causing identity crises. And simultaneously, violence against Black trans women can came to be seen as something that could enable cisgender heterosexual men to recuperate their position in a hierarchy of masculinities. And that this violence then produced and maintained cisness for these men. A tension really emerged between both desire for trans women and disgust of trans women. And so cisgender heterosexual men may find themselves physically attracted to transgender women while simultaneously feeling disgusted or angered at the possibility that the woman they're into is not cis. And in part, the affective dimension of anger and disgust rise out of this regulation of what it means to be cis by other cishet men and by cisgender women. And so to be with a trans woman really comes to say something about the person with them. And as an additional example of this, CJ Pascoe built on her work in a piece, in a blog piece, in which she talked to some heterosexual men about their experiences in regards to the policing of their masculinity. And she writes of this conversation that she had with a student who's now grown up. And he said, when I was little, I loved playing with Barbies. My sister, she always told me to put them away. And one day she got so fed up, she dragged me outside and shoved Barbies in all my pockets and made me stand there while my friends laughed at me. And so what I argue really is that violence in many forms, not just physical violence, but also these forms of violence, like what this sister is committing, which I would argue is a form of violence meant to really teach this young boy how to be a boy in their eyes, as well as obviously the many other forms of violence, like TJ discussed. Violence itself is a part of doing gender. It's a part of being seen as a gendered person in a gendered world, because being gendered means that we're held accountable in Raewyn Connell's words, to a certain form of conduct. And when we stray outside of that expectation, others are there, in my participants' words, to set us straight, to make sure that we understand that we are stepping over the boundaries of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. Um, and so I find it, I'm not really a huge fan always of psychoanalysis, but I actually find this work by Eliot and Lyons on the understanding of phobias to actually be really instructive in thinking about violence and about what it means to commit violence against Black trans women. Um, they argue that the function of a phobic object is to specify and contain a threat. And this threat is signaled by some sort of feeling of anxiety. And in phobias, this anxiety can be fixed in phobic objects, whose presence then evokes the anxiety thereby contained. So these fears of being seen as less than a man or less than a heterosexual man, in many ways, I argue, become placed in transgender women, or become put away as a fear, and relegated to other people who stray beyond the boundaries of society. And so when people come in contact with them, it reevokes that anxiety in many ways. Goffman also really talks about the ways in which stigma comes to be something that marks individuals. And in his words, Black trans women and trans women of color at large really become stigmatized through quote unquote abominations of the body, or these sorts of blemishes of character based on who they are, and an assumed mismatch of biology. And in situations where cisgender individuals are confronted with disruptions to gender and sex essentialism, they may work to really frantically assert or reassert this binary. Laurel Westbrook and Kirsten Schill also term this reaction a gender panic. But through their analyses of policies, they end up noting that gender panics might actually be more properly named penis panics, due to the perceived danger imposed on an individual with a penis, and the ways in which often penises come to figure into discussions of trans women and trans women as violent and assaultive and a threat. And so in all of this, the doing of gender really is a relational process. Gender and sexuality and sex are constructed through these relations, and they simultaneously require the objection of bodies that reveal the fiction of binary logic. And trans bodies come to serve as a border that determines the necessity and the impossibility of these differences between trans bodies and cis bodies. And even the very creation of the word cisgender really occurred out of a need to better linguistically differentiate non-trans bodies from trans bodies after transgender itself was already established as a word. So transness really surrounds cisness, delimiting its borders. And I argue when cisgender people come into romantic or sexual contact with trans people, those borders become blurred. And that blurring of borders is solved through an act of violence. So in my work, what I think is really important in regards to this understanding of violence is what it means to really think about cisness within research and within society at large. And I argue that cisness is not just about someone being a cisgender person, but that cisness really is this ideological and political and cultural manifestation that shapes the ways in which we understand the world, the ways in which we interact with one another, and the ways in which we respond to various phenomena in society. And that cisness really relies as much, if not more, on language and discourse as it does on physical violence. And in particular, that it's a necropolitical force, which I build on from Mbembe, in terms of really understanding cisness as something that relies on the death of others. That the death of Black trans women is what allows for the reproduction and perpetuation of cisness. And that cisness feeds off these deaths in many ways. So I know I'm probably at time, so I'm just going to mention this briefly, but I think in talking about violence against people, things can sometimes seem impossible to change or just uh, I prefer not to end on a negative note in regards to all of this violence happening, very real violence that people experience every day. And so I think something that's important to think about in addressing this violence is the existence of violence intervention or prevention programs. And there are many examples in Chicago alone, like Chicago Creds, which uses a multifaceted approach to reducing gun violence. And they go beyond preventing violence in the moment, but instead really target structural and social determinants of violence by providing trauma counseling and life coaching and career mentorship and training in soft skills and advocacy and more. And Ready Chicago, which is built out of U Chicago and relies on cognitive behavioral therapy techniques to also address gun violence and other forms of violence in neighborhoods where it's most likely to occur. And I think in many ways, this work can be adapted and be built on to help men work through gendered issues and conflicts and to prevent further murders. That we really can approach this violence as not just something that is uh, uh, the fault of one person who committed that violence, but really is society is responsible. And so because society is responsible, we have to respond with more than just some sort of punitive approach to that individual, but also with workshops and forums and forms of popular education that can be held in communities to educate around trans violence, to educate the community around what it means to be trans, to develop social bonds between people, and to instill norms against violence. Alongside posters and bus ads and murals demanding an end to violence and highlighting the consequences of it. And that prior perpetrators and victims of this violence alike could be part of these programs to really transform their communities in similar ways as the perpetrators and victims of gun violence work within these programs. So I will end here, but I just want to say thank you again for having me on this panel. If you're interested in more, I discuss this more in my work in both of these books, but my work is also available as free PDFs. Also, please don't tell anyone that is in the publishing world at my website, which you can get either at this QR code or the website. And thank you again.
Right. Thank you so much, Alithia. Okay. These are some heavy topics, but I loved how the last presentation ended with that focus on, hey, this is a collective responsibility. So it's a collective opportunity for us to be able to make change. And so there's good news here. It's just we got to work together to keep it going. All right. Ash is going to present next. Ash, you can begin whenever you're ready.
Hi, everybody. Just saying, also my appreciation for both Erica and T, also for like doing the work to get us here in the tech, and also excited to share something that I hope is useful from some of my work with you all, and to be in conversation also with TJ and Alethea and you all here. So I want to just reintroduce, so my name in the slide here, and I'll get into it. But I'm Ash Stevens. I use both he and they pronouns, so feel free to sort of like switch them up. And I'm in the Department of Criminology, Law and Justice at UIC, so just down the road. So I think part of the beauty, I was taking a bunch of notes earlier, but part of the kind of beauty of like panels like this, and I think related to last week, is that I was already hearing and feeling and seeing a bunch of stuff that puts us in a natural kind of conversation together. So I want to try to like make some connections as I go through my presentation, and maybe that'll be useful to kind of see, I think, like how we're coming to similar uh, discussions or debates or I guess even kind of like noticings of unfortunate, of course, violence and risk of violence against trans folks, as this panel is called, but maybe from different angles and places. So I studied or have studied as a social scientist, and also have been an organizer in Chicago through different organizations for like social change across the city. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a piece that was called The Bad Parents, Gender Policing of Transgender, Nonconforming, and Non-Binary People in the US. And then I want to like also maybe draw some connections between that and so that was part of a larger project, but then a newer project that I'm hoping to turn into a book project focused on anti-trans legislation. So I want to talk about that a little bit and say like what those two projects maybe have to do with each other, as a way that I'm sort of thinking about and been thinking with people about violence and harm, and ways that we can use, I think, more of a sort of abolitionist framework to think about like what we can do or what people are doing. So those are the kind of like two things I want to mostly talk about today. So relatedly, for the first part, so again, because my main discipline is sort of like criminology studies, when I went into the project that became the article that I'm going to shorthand called Bad Parents, that I can link for you all, people are interested. I was really interested in talking to people about their experiences with like the police or with law enforcement or with like TSA in particular, which I did ask people questions about, and other forms of sort of like state actors who participate in various forms of like violence against trans and non-binary people's lives in particular. And if other people are doing or have been doing sort of like projects where you do interviews or like storytelling or like oral histories, right? Like you might have a thing you're interested in or curiosity. And then the really helpful and I think the really fruitful part about that is that then you talk to people and they may tell you something totally different. They're like, well, actually, that is important to my life, or also something else is important, or something else has sort of shown up, or like, oh, maybe you didn't think of this nuance or this thing. So what happened when I was interested in interviewing people about those kinds of experiences, so like capital P police or like law enforcement or TSA or other forms of like administrative violence. So like trying to get an ID card or social security card or something like that, like how people experience those things and how they were treated. Everyone that I spoke to, though, began when I asked them an initial question about experiences of policing, and that's how I put it specifically, they started talking to me about their family. So they talked a lot to me about the sort of like interconnectedness between like living in a family who was or was not sort of like affirming or supportive, which I'll get to, and how family had tried to control or monitor some form of their behavior or their life. So doing that and having the interviews and having the conversations really helped to kind of shift me. Oh, sorry, I was going to time myself, so I'm actually going to like start timing myself now. Really shifted me, I think, not away from like law enforcement, but for me to think about the family as like a particular location and site of policing. But I think hopefully in a more kind of like nuanced way. So one of the folks that I spoke to, who is the quote is up here from, this is a pseudonym for a person who's a Black trans woman who lives in the US. In the midst of our interview, I asked her this question about policing, and she said this thing, which is here, which is the only people that I can think of that tried to police me were my parents. And like later on, we talked about her experience as both a self-identified sort of like street-based sex worker and street performer. And so she talked about like law enforcement interactions and like the time being incarcerated. But it was really, again, interesting to me that started off our conversation with this quote, and like it moved me into a different direction to think about how interactions with family can like, of course, maybe interrupt or set up people's lives in a maybe different kind of way, as they're trying to navigate their own sense of bodily autonomy and like affirmation. And so as we started sort of talking about this, I switched up some of the questions in this project for everybody else. And I asked them that question about policing, but then I started to ask them more things about like what happens in your family? Like how do people, like how might people interact with you? How do you think about policing related to family? And like what does that kind of look like? So for another person I talked to, I won't read this quote, whose name that I gave them was Leo. He mentioned sort of this. And so a lot of what came out in these conversations with people were around dress or were around even like job choices or other, or even, other sort of like medicalized versions of life if they wanted to, or even other kinds of like life choices. And so in the project and in the kind of article more broadly, like I think about this as something called like people-based methods. And so all that means is that like when I'm doing the thing that I'm doing as a social scientist, like I'm trying to like co-produce like an understanding with the people I'm talking to. So I might have a set of questions or whatever, but again, I was like, how do I theorize or how do I think about policing beyond just law enforcement or the cops? Because people are telling me that this is important, that family is important in my interviews. So that's how I just think about like people-based methods. It's like, how do we do the thing together as opposed to me doing that thing as an interviewer where I'm like, here's my agenda and here's what I think is important only. And like, you just tell me, tell me some stuff that might fit into that narrative. So that's the kind of like setup, I think a bit about like how I got to family. And so I want to say why I think that's important in many ways and like how that got me to like pieces of anti-trans legislation that I think other folks were talking about too. So what I noticed in those conversations and those interviews in particular was especially the Black folks who I spoke to, the Black trans folks who I spoke to, and non-binary folks who I spoke to, and some of the other trans folks of color who I spoke to, like they all started talking to me about family first, which was important. However, they talked to me about family in these like kind of like ping pong ways. So it was both here, which you're like reading from Leo about like the kind of way that family would try to control like his movement or what he could wear or those kinds of things. Um, but then it was also this, so I'm switching slides now, back to something that Love told me, which I will read, what she says. So she identifies now as a trans woman. She identified as a gay man many, many years ago. And she sort of says like, coming out as a gay man, a feminine gay guy, and being overly feminine with my clothes, boy pants, and a girl top, they were fine with that. So she's talking about her parents. They were content with sexy Brandon, is what she says. They did feel a little more leery of me when I was in the street for me to possibly be attacked. But then when Love got here, that's when the problem came. And so as I was talking to folks again, and I noticed this sort of like going back and forth between this like both control and also, for lack of a better word, sort of like protective posture. And they would even say that there's something happening here around protection. Well, I know my family is trying to like tell me not to be who I am in some way. Um, and they're also knowing the potential for violence that I might experience as a person walking on the street or trying to live my life or trying to get a job or trying to access housing or some other sort of like form of state-based protection. And so I know that they're doing this thing because they may not agree with, the way I present or who I am. And they also know that the potential for violence towards me is real. And so they want to, in some way, try to shield me from that. And so it felt important to me to try to sit in that nuance with the folks that I was talking with and continue to talk with many of whom I still talk with around other projects. Because part of the kind of like queer or trans or sort of LGBTQ, I think sort of like narrative literature in many ways can be very singular in that like family is either like this place of total like rejection, that like our families don't love us, they don't care about us, they're like all bad, or our families are supposed to be this place of like care and support and, camaraderie and like whatever, right? Like that's how the family is sort of like largely branded, especially under a kind of like, of course, both a kind of like Christian nationalist sort of frame, and even I think towards a sort of like neoliberal framework, because your family is supposed to be this place of protection, or it's just this total place of rejection for queer people, right? Like people don't love us and like whatever. And so I don't mean to like make light of that at all, because I think that is a real experience, set of experiences for a lot of folks. And our lives are so much more nuanced. And so to sort of have an uncomfortable conversation around how both like race and gender expression or identity or whatever we want to call it for sake of conversation, transness in particular, and class and all these other sorts of axes sort of interact, at least in this project for the folks that I spoke with, means to really take seriously that like the messiness between the two. And so family wasn't just this place of like rejection only or this place of care only, but both existed. And so to try to live in that place of ness. So that's like the part one, and that's like what the kind of article I think tries to do and like tries to get at. And what was really valuable about that, and in a moment I'll segue to the kind of anti-trans ledge piece, was for myself and the folks I talked to was to think about family policing as a helpful framework to understand some of the escalation in forms of anti-trans legislation and bills that we have been seeing at least. A lot of my work is more on like 2020 to present, so at least in that moment. So putting these two things in kind of conversation. So that's the kind of second part of like the attempt that I want to do, right? Is like how like what is family policing and like was I thinking about it? Why were people thinking and talking about family policing? And like how maybe that can help us understand or think about some forms of anti-trans bills or legislation, and like maybe like what we can do or like other things that we can be doing in order to push back against those things. So the complication and the kind of nuance, right? So family policing, right, like as a structuring force, and the family as an institution, as many of us know. So I'm gonna like probably repeat many things that I know folks on the panel here already know, of course, right? Is like, of course, not just this place of like love and affirmation, but also is an institution of control and of a reproduction of both gender norms and roles, and also a reproduction of forms of gender violence, right? So we have to like think about the family as like a structuring force and as an institution. And so if I think about the family as that, so the nuclear family in many ways, but if I so that's a part of family policing. But I also think about family policing as like the other forms of state-based sort of like control and monitoring and surveillance that introduce themselves into people's family lives beyond the nuclear family. So this is like the role of, broadly speaking, the sort of role of the state, and I'll get more minute, in our kind of everyday family lives. So this is, someone in your family may have been incarcerated or something, or experienced some form of like incarceration or, whatever, probation or some sense. And the state has like decided that it is the sort of entity that's going to come to your house and do these like routine checks on your home. So they introduce themselves literally and physically into our lives, and make these determinations about fitness or about who can fit, as in like fit, who is fit to be with who is fit to live with who can take care of whom, under what conditions, what we can have and not have, what access to things, in this moment, right? Things around like SNAP and food stamps and all those kinds of things. So like our families are a source of like control in our lives, but also the state introduces itself into our families and our family systems and our family lives, especially if we consider the axes of like things like race and class, or impact on people who are formerly or currently incarcerated, on people who are taking care of young children, people who might be street-based, people who work in street economies, like people who are, migrant folks, all those kinds of folks, people who are disabled, right, and may depend on the state for different forms of aid, those kinds of things. And so a structure or an understanding of family policing allows, I think, me and hopefully us, many of us, to like think about the family as beyond just the kind of people that we might like or might not like, who live with us or who don't live with us or whatever, and who we get along with and maybe we don't get along with, all that kind of stuff, right? So I'm thinking about that. I'm holding that again as the people who I interviewed brought that kind of understanding to me, even in just like these like quotes like this, where I was just like, oh yeah, the family is so much more important and so much more nuanced and so much more interesting than I, was a part of my own original kind of understanding or even just kind of interest. So I'm holding that, and then and I'll segue in a second into the kind of legislative piece too. And I'm thinking about this. So two folks who are sociologists, and they edited a volume called Ghost Criminology. So Lyman and Turner. So they wrote this note in a piece that they were writing that says, like, despite their looming presence in public life, police quite often perform the trick of being conspicuously absent. I mean, I like the way that they sort of like phrase that and brought that up. And I think other people talk about this too, like Mia Miguez and other people. Talk about like the cops in our heads, right? And so like the police don't have to physically be present. Maybe your parent or somebody is like a cop or whatever, so they might actually live with you, but they don't have to actually live with us or be with us at all times for us to sort of like perform the job for them. Like we perform the work of trying to control or monitor each other's behavior, even if they aren't present. And sometimes they are through other forms of technology, which is some other work that I do. But sometimes they just aren't. They're not everywhere at all times physically, but we can do that work for them. And there's more here about like a kind of a ghost or a ghostly figure. So I'm thinking about that alongside then these forms of bills that TJ had already up. So we were already like thinking in the same way. And I'm thinking about some of the bills here then, so I won't have this up for too long because you already saw this. This is the 2026 numbers that they showed a minute ago. But I'm thinking about all of this in relationship to something like this from Missouri. So I don't know if people had seen this. So this is from 2 years ago. But this was a proposed bill from Missouri, and at the time was in some ways uh, like a, I don't want to say revolutionary in a good way, but in a terrible way. It was sort of revolutionary because it brought in this other layer of criminalization that folks I think were anticipating but maybe hadn't seen yet. So this bill, if people aren't familiar, so it was like HB 2885, which was this proposed bill in Missouri that was concerned with something called social transition. So in the bill, it like defines social transition as this process by which an individual adopts the name, pronouns, um, and gender expression, such as like clothing or haircuts or whatever, that match the individual's gender identity and not the gender assigned by the individual's sex at birth. That's the language itself in the bill. And so it's located or was located at the school level, and particularly was aimed at like preventing kids and young people, of course, in like K through 12 schools from, expressing their full selves while at school. And so the bill was trying to mandate that teachers and school counselors in particular, and other people working in school context, if they supported this thing called social transition, right, that they could possibly be charged with a Class E felony and a Class E felony in that context. So that's like any form of support, like trying to provide any form of support, regardless of if the support was like material or just like information or something like that, that they could possibly be receive charges under a Class E felony. And in this context would mean that folks might have to register as like sex offenders under this like tier 1 level sex offender registry in Missouri. So again, I'm thinking a lot presently and have been thinking about all of that I said about the family in that context, the way the family is supposed to be branded to us, whether again or not that's true. Of course, it's more complex. Trans and queer people know that, of course. But then thinking about bills like this that are forcing or attempting to force teachers, counselors, coaches, like all these sorts of people, especially in young people's lives, to actively be non-supportive of queer and trans students and young folks, right? So there's something again here that I think is really helpful about the family as a space of care, and as branded a space of care and support, because those same people are branded as such too. A counselor is branded as this person that's supposed to be like the most, a site of affirmation and love or whatever. So is a healthcare provider, so is a teacher, so is your coach or your athletic worker or whatever. And so, in the other part of so from that article, the bad parents thing, which is kind of morphing me into a different way to think about care. I'm thinking about care in the broader book project as like the way that the state in particular is trying to deputize all of us, especially people who work in many places that are deemed sort of like care spaces, schools, healthcare providers, sports locations, all of that stuff. I think both TJ and I think Alithia were also talking about too. Like people who are in those spaces are trying to be given the sort of state authority to enact particular kinds of violence on not just young queer and trans people, but especially in some of these instances related to K through 12 schools, and how care is structured as, of course, a form of like control and regulation. But also that means then, and this I'll close out in a second, is that I'm thinking with folks like Dorothy Roberts, Sophie Lewis, Emmy O'Brien, and people like that, that like we need a real transformation or undoing or untethering ourselves of this idea of like care. And so that's where sort of like a framework of like carceral care work is helpful to a lot of my thinking too, because that allows me again to think about the family as not just this place of affirmation, but a place of regulation. So not just school as like a place of affirmation, but also a potential place of regulation. Not just sports locations as a place of like, we get to all play and do whatever, but also as places of like regulation and enforcement. And so when I move in that direction, so this is just the rest are some sort of pictures of stuff. So this is about voters and sort of like the people who supported a legislative proposal that parents should be told about anything that young people are trying to do at school in order to like live out who they are. So this is nothing, the language is usually that this is like some giant sort of like shift to someone's life, which it is like internally and as experience. But it's like if you change your hair color or if you just like tell people, what your pronouns are or whatever, that parents have to be told about that in school, right? And if not, again, people who are supposed to be over young people's care in schools and other places can be, can receive charges. So I should also say in the Missouri context, that bill did not pass, and related to the chart that also TJ showed earlier, most of the bills that we talk about like don't actually pass through, but I have something different to say about them not passing. And so it doesn't mean that they aren't important, that they don't pass. I think it actually is really important that they don't. And they continue to get tried, to get reproduced, to get sort of like, what's the word? People try, different states try to replay them. And different people in different locations, as these photos are trying to show you all, sort of like try to block them, right? Like they sort of try to do things to make sure that they don't exist. And at the same time, these are some other sort of photos of people talking about affirmation. What an abolitionist sort of like feminist framework for me allows me to think about, though, is not just that the bills didn't happen and that they didn't go through law and that we should consider that a win in some way. What I'm trying to think with, again, with the people I've interviewed and more folks that I want to talk to, is like what it means to establish a practice of like real abolitionist non-compliance. So like making concerted effort to say, we are not gonna, and I'm gonna use this very simple language, like we're not gonna snitch on each other under any circumstance. So to say like, I'm not gonna tell the state if I am supporting this young person who wants to change their name or do whatever under any circumstance. And explicitly to do that, and to do that broad-based, not just sort of internally, not just when people aren't looking, or sort of not just when, it's like a one-to-one thing, but to literally push back on the ask that's being asked of all of us, which is to tell on each other at all times. And in particular, to like name the people who are in our lives or we see or whatever, who are trans or who are queer or who are undocumented or whatever, and to really act out a sort of politics of noncompliance. And so how might that shift, I think, how might that shift our sort of like practice of not just relying on the legal landscape, or not just sort of relying on like policy analysts or experts, but again, we are all being implicated in a state-based practice to deputize us to like really go after, whether I think we are doing it or not is one thing, but a lot of these bills are trying to get us to to not just conform, but to sort of actively engage with the state in a way that is trying to force us to either not be supportive or to actively be totally harmful to queer and trans folks in particular in this context. And so again, a sort of practice of non-compliance is beyond something like affirmation and just, love and supportive care. I think that's in there. But it's also really like a restructuring of like what it means to push back beyond a legal framework, beyond just the bill has died and that's the end of it. But more so to look at all the ways that we are being asked again to be the police when the police aren't around, and to do more than just say no, but to do something else. And so something else is what I want to talk through with other people and to keep thinking about. But I'll stop there because I think I'm probably at time. And that's kind of how the first project got me to the thinking about this, the new project. And then the last thing I will say though, I want to plug, and I think this is helpful to what a lot of what you all were saying too, and part of what I'm trying to say too. There is a great book. Sarah Lamble's book through Haymarket is coming out soon. It's called Unsafe: The Carceral Roots of the Anti-Trans Backlash. I think it'll come out in August. And so like Lamble is thinking, I think, a lot with some of what you all were saying about the sort of like the whole of society approach that was mentioned. And the kind of ways that like people are, I think Alithia, you were talking about the person sort of like weaponizing the young man's sort of like sexuality against him and like that weaponization and how that's happening, that kind of thing. And like and again, like thinking about these bills as forms of like carcerality and harm and punishment and not just sort of like animus or just hatred, I think is like TJ was saying. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Ash. All right, we don't have much time for discussion. So I guess I will ask the panelists maybe each to answer this one question. It might take us maybe 2 minutes overtime, and I hope everybody is willing to stay at least that much. So my question would just be, these are tough topics, right? Each of your presentations individually deal with kind of tough topics, and then, us sitting with it as a whole, it's heavy, right? And each of you have talked a bit about some of the solutions. Solutions is a strong word, but some of the ways that these problems can be mitigated, can be helped. And I was just wondering if you could, besides what you had mentioned, or if you can go in more detail about what you mentioned, can you say more about those things and your hope for them and and even if it's crossed with warnings as well. But yeah, can we kind of just have a more reflection on what else didn't you get to, or can you elaborate a little bit about some of the ways that these issues can be helped?
Mm.
So, I mean, I can start off by maybe just asking TJ directly. So you mentioned these ecologies
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
incorporate so many things. Can you repeat that part about how that can help and maybe where to look for where we can have a starting point with those?
Yeah, I mean, so I think part of the issue is that there is a really strong kind of interdigitation of public and private policy where it concerns disinformation. It's not just about what are governments and states doing, but it is also like what are platforms doing, which kind of operate as these kind of their own domains of communication policy making that are semi-independent of the state. Like, yes, there's technically laws, but like because of First Amendment stuff, there's not a lot that can be done with regards to platforms. So I've focused increasingly in my work not on how can we like fix the platforms or things like that because I'm not sure that we can, and I also think that it also avoids the fundamentally social and cultural roots of the problem. And so I didn't talk about it because it gets into a very different domain. But I have a preprint on SSRN if anyone wants to go find it. But I've been focusing a lot on basically like how do we curb people's appetite for misinformation by thinking about misinformation as like a resource they use to perform a particular function. And I think, Alethea and Ash both were getting in different ways to a lot of what those functions are, right? There's a certain reification of a normative order, a reassertion of interpretive stability that misinformation provides. And I think if we help change our kind of systems of meaning and help people along in the kind of reconstruction of worldviews such that transness doesn't feel threatening to them in various ways. We can make misinformation less desirable because they don't need it to do anything for themselves affectively. And I think when we think about, Ash talking about the deputizing of people to to police, it is crucial that of all the bills that do pass, yes, most don't, but of the ones that do, they're mostly in education contexts where there is like this kind of like state identified like police person in the person of the teacher or the school administrator. But that does extend to like women policing. Is that a real woman in the bathroom with me? And like in sport, like is my opponent a real woman? And I think if we are able to deconstruct the police person inside individual people's head by dealing with the kind of emotional turmoil, so to speak, that transness brings to them, I think we can do a lot to the interactional level of violence that we're thinking about.
Yeah, that's so interesting and very similar to Alithia, what you were talking about, these opportunities for reflection while also trying to advocate for structural change. Can you say more about um, how you've interacted with these, ways to attend to this?
Yeah, I think, and something I'm very interested in exploring more, um, in a U.S. context, I look to Cuba in many ways as an example of what can be done to prevent transphobic acts of violence, because uh, Cuba is actually, uh, in my opinion, a sort of leader when it comes to LGBT rights within the hemisphere. When individuals are dealing with questions that they have, or confusion, or anger, or whatever it might be about LGBT people around them, the government itself sends out counselors and social workers to help them work through their issues that they have with trans people or queer people existing. And most recently, they actually have begun funding popular education across the entire island through the form of different organizations like CENASEX, which is the Center for Sex Education, but is also one of the leading LGBT organizations in the country, and the network of Afro-descendant communities and other organizations like that to carry out popular education across the island around issues of racism and sexism and homophobia and more, to really engage people in a process of changing who they are culturally and socially. Because there are obviously so many ways in a policy sort of environment that we could attempt to mitigate or end violence. But the reality is that violence, and especially violence that is targeted towards marginalized people, so much of this is predicated on, to what TJ spoke about, disinformation, and a culture that has uh, uh, become awash in this sort of hegemonic idea of what it means to be a particular person and what it means to be a human. And none of that can be changed by just a law, right? Like it requires us to actually struggle through that as people, mentally and internally and socially. And so uh, I think the sorts of violence intervention and prevention programs that exist in cities like Chicago are great resources in that regard to build upon, because they are so focused on not just telling people don't shoot, but are actually working to get at the roots of this, right? By transforming the lives of both perpetrators and victims of violence.
Yeah, so it really kind of comes full circle back to abolitionist frameworks. So Ash, do you want to close us out with any closing words about um, how we attend to violence and harm?
Well, I would agree with what was already said, and I was kind of sneak looking at the question about how to engage students. So I think maybe just one thing is so what was gifted to me by a colleague, Nadine Neber, who's at USC, was was to constantly think more about like joint struggle. And so something I try to do, and I think this is with like any issue, especially in my classroom or even like with people I know is part of how to engage and have a conversation is like the way that I might have framed what I frame right now. Like part of the conversation that I'm framing is like about what people need and what their lives are like and all that kind of stuff. Because I think what we all have said also is that everything we spoke about was very particular, maybe today and in a lot of context to trans people, but we're also having conversations about everybody. And so for me, what it means to talk about joint struggle is also to talk about that. So like like life chances, violence, forms of deprivation, like housing inequity, like those kinds of things, like those things are affecting so many people and everyone that for me, like part of a conversation about trans lives and trans violence or trans, all the things come within a context of that. And so like I teach a class about sports and like we have a section where we are talking about, like anti-trans bills in sport and like debunking some of the thoughts and ideas and mythologies about, trans athletes and sports in general. So anyway, so for me, that I guess that's the last thing I'll say is that like I think part of us kind of like attempted to underscore that piece that um it's important to have a set of conversations that we're having now, maybe in a particular fashion around how they impact trans lives, but also not in a vacuum. And I think for some people that opens up a different space when you have a conversation about joint struggle and about how they're experiencing life and what's happening for them, and to show the interconnectedness and the nuance. And to me, that's also about like how we get to these other places of like possibility and advancement and like more livability for everybody in that way. So that's the only thing I would say as I was sneak looking at the questions too.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This panel was only uh, billed to end at 1:30, so we'll have to end here. But if panelists are willing to stay, and if there are people who want to discuss any questions with the panelists afterwards, you're welcome to stay. If folks have to leave, including panelists, feel free. But thank you so much for being here and making us a part of your day. And thank you, panelists, for your awesome presentations.